never believed in ghosts or the paranormal, until that fateful day when I stepped foot inside the old cemetery. It was a hot summer day, and I was exploring the outskirts of town, looking for a place to clear my mind and find some peace. That's when I stumbled upon the old, abandoned cemetery. It had a creepy aura about it, but I shrugged it off and decided to explore. As soon as I entered, I was hit with a musty smell and the sound of crows cawing in the distance. The gravestones were old and weathered, some barely legible. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my curiosity getting the best of me. That's when I saw her. A young girl, no older than 10 years old, sat on one of the headstones. She was dressed in a white, tattered dress and had long, jet black hair that covered her face. I couldn't see her clearly, but I could feel her eyes on me. I started to approach her, thinking she was just a lost child, but as I got closer, I noticed something odd about her. The girl had no feet. It's as if she was floating on the headstone. That's when I realized she was not of this world. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in fear as she slowly lifted her head and looked straight at me. Her eyes were black as coal and seemed to pierce through my soul. She let out a piercing scream that seemed to echo through the cemetery. I finally broke free from my paralyzed state and ran out of there as fast as I could. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that followed me after that encounter. I told myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I had seen a ghost. I decided to do some research about the old cemetery and see if there were any stories or legends about it. What I found sent chills down my spine. The cemetery was built on top of an old Native American burial ground. Legend has it that the spirits of the Native Americans were not at rest, and they haunted anyone who dared to disturb their resting place. But that's not all. There were also rumors of a little girl who was buried alive in the cemetery, and her spirit still roams around, seeking revenge on anyone who crosses her path. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It all seemed too far-fetched, but after my encounter with the little girl in the cemetery, I couldn't deny the possibility of it being true. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my home. Days turned into weeks, and I tried my best to forget about the cemetery and the little girl, but she wouldn't let me. Every night, I would see her in my dreams, beckoning me to come back to the cemetery. I was starting to lose my mind. I decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator, hoping they could give me some answers and put my mind at ease. The investigator, a tall man with dark circles under his eyes, agreed to accompany me to the cemetery. He said he had a bad feeling about it, but I assured him it was just a silly ghost story. As soon as we entered the cemetery, his demeanor changed. He seemed tense and kept looking over his shoulder. We walked around the cemetery, taking readings and pictures. The investigator stopped in front of a gravestone and pointed towards it. The gravestone belonged to the little girl I had seen. The investigator explained that her name was Rose and she was buried alive in this very cemetery. He also revealed that there have been reports of people disappearing within the cemetery, never to be seen again. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The investigator urged me to leave, but I couldn't leave without finding some closure. That's when my worst nightmare came true. I turned around and saw the little girl standing behind me, her black eyes now glowing red. She let out another ear-piercing scream, and I could feel her getting closer. I tried to run, but it was too late. The last thing I remembered was her face inches away from mine before everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by my family. They told me that they found me unconscious in the cemetery and I had a high fever. They thought I had heat stroke, but I knew it was something much more sinister. I never went back to the cemetery, and I never spoke about that day to anyone. But I can still feel her presence, watching me, waiting for me to return to the cemetery. From that day on, I never doubted the existence of ghosts and the paranormal. I learned my lesson the hard way, and I will never forget the cemetery horror story that changed my life forever. I never believed in ghosts. I always thought that the idea of spirits wandering among us was nothing more than a figment of the human imagination. That was until I experienced firsthand the terror of a cemetery at night. It was a warm, summer evening and my friends and I had decided to sneak into the local cemetery for some thrills. We thought it would be a fun and daring adventure, something to make us feel alive. Little did we know, we were about to step into a nightmare. As we made our way through the rusted iron gate, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Gravestones loomed over us, their names and dates weathered away by time. But there was something sinister about the way they stood, almost as if they were watching us. We laughed and joked, trying to mask our fear as we made our way deeper into the cemetery. It was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from our hushed whispers and the occasional rustle of leaves under our feet. I could feel my heart racing, my palms becoming sweaty. This was not the adventure I had imagined. As we approached a particularly old section of the cemetery, I noticed a figure standing near a grave, its back turned towards us. My friends didn't seem to notice, too caught up in their own chatter. But as we got closer, I realized that this figure was not human. It was a woman, dressed in a long, black dress, her skin a ghostly pale. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her hair hung in tangles around her face. I wanted to scream, to run away, but my feet were frozen in place. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer out, my voice trembling. The woman slowly turned to face us, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "I am the keeper of this cemetery," she said in a voice like nails on a chalkboard, "and you should not be here." With that, she disappeared into thin air, leaving us standing there in shock and disbelief. But before we could even process what had just happened, we heard a low, guttural growl coming from the ground. We looked down to see the earth trembling and splitting open, revealing a pair of skeletal hands clawing their way out. My friends and I screamed in terror as more and more skeletons emerged, their hollow eyes fixed on us. I realized then that we had disturbed the dead, and there was no going back. We ran, our hearts pounding in our chests, but the skeletons followed us, their bones rattling in a horrifying symphony. We could feel them getting closer and closer, their bony fingers reaching out to grab us. I could feel their icy breath on my neck, their whispered threats of eternal damnation. But we finally managed to make it to the iron gate, barely escaping the clutches of the undead. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with fear. We knew that we had to get out of there, but as we looked back, we saw that the skeletons were still chasing us. Except now, they had been joined by other dark figures, their red eyes glowing in the moonlight. We ran through the streets, screaming for help, but no one came. We were alone in our terror, our own personal hell. And then, out of nowhere, we heard a voice. It was the woman we had seen in the cemetery, her ghostly figure materializing in front of us. "You should have listened," she said, her voice filled with malice. "This cemetery is cursed, and now, you are all cursed too. You will never escape." And with that, she vanished, taking the skeletons and dark figures with her. We were left alone, shaken and traumatized by what we had just experienced. We never spoke of that night again, but the horror never left us. In the weeks that followed, my friends and I were plagued by nightmares and strange occurrences. We would see the woman and the skeletons everywhere we went, a constant reminder of the evil that lurked in that cemetery. I learned a valuable lesson that summer night. Ghosts are not just a figment of the human imagination. They are real, and they will haunt you if you dare to disturb their resting place. Ever since I was a child, I've always been drawn to cemeteries. The quietness and stillness of the grounds always held a strange fascination for me. The tall, dark trees that seemed to loom over the graves, and the crumbling headstones that told stories of the past never failed to give me an eerie feeling. But it wasn't until that fateful night at the cemetery that I learned to truly fear the dead. It was a typical Friday night, and my friends and I were looking for something to do. We were all feeling daring and decided to visit the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. We had heard rumors of strange occurrences happening there, and we wanted to see if they were true. As we walked through the gates, I couldn't help but shiver. The air was thicker here, and I could feel a sense of foreboding. We wandered through the graves, reading the names and dates on the headstones. Some dated back centuries, and the older ones had become nearly illegible. We laughed and joked, making light of the eerie atmosphere. But as the sun began to set, our laughter faded. That's when we saw a figure standing by one of the gravestones. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal. Its features were obscured by darkness, but I could feel its stare on us. Fear clutched at my heart as we stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, in a flash, the figure disappeared behind a nearby headstone. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed, before running in the opposite direction. We made our way back to the gates as fast as our legs could carry us, not daring to look back. As we reached safety, we all breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. But as we turned to leave, we heard a faint whisper, "Leave now, before it's too late." It was a voice unlike any we had ever heard before, hollow and full of malice. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran all the way back to our cars, not stopping until we were miles away from that cursed place. I wanted to forget about that night, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that we had disturbed something in that cemetery. And as days went by, strange things started happening to me. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the name Lucinda echoing in my mind. I brushed it off as a nightmare until I started seeing her in my dreams. She was always standing by the cemetery gates, beckoning me to come closer. I couldn't take it anymore and decided to visit the cemetery alone. I needed to confront whatever it was that was haunting me. As I walked through the gates, I could feel a chill run down my spine. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying flowers, and I could hear branches snapping under my feet. I made my way to the grave marked Lucinda and saw that it was freshly dug up. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around to see the same figure we had seen the other night. This time, I could see its face. Its eyes were sunken, and its skin was a sickly shade of gray. I stumbled back in terror as it spoke to me in that same, hollow voice. "I've been waiting for you," it said. "You have disturbed my resting place, and now you must pay for it." I tried to run, but I was rooted in place. The figure reached out toward me, and I could feel a strange energy coursing through my body. Memories flashed before my eyes. Memories of Lucinda, a young girl who had been buried alive in this very cemetery. She had died with a deep hatred for the living, and her spirit had been trapped in this place ever since. And now, it was looking for a vessel, a living being to possess and continue her reign of terror. But I refused to be that vessel. With all my might, I pushed the figure away and ran out of the cemetery as fast as I could. I never looked back. To this day, I am plagued by nightmares of that night at the cemetery. I never returned, and I pray that I never have to. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can hear Lucinda's voice whispering for me to come back. And I know that as long as that cemetery stands, her spirit will continue to torment anyone who dares to disturb her resting place.